Who would look at me and imagine that I am the daughter of a Windrush era migrant, a first generation child of the famous migration that brought almost 500,000 people from the Caribbean to the UK between 1948 and 1971. To do that, you would need to know a history that you were never taught at school, and that's the hidden history of a system called indenture. You see, my great-grandparents weren't African Caribbean. They were Indians from India who were brought to the Caribbean to work on British colonial sugar plantations in the 19th century. By the time indenture was abolished in 1917, the system had spread from Mauritius in the Caribbean to Fiji, South Africa, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, and beyond. To put this in perspective, under the British Empire, people of Indian heritage were transported through the indenture system to countries on 5 different continents. My great-grandmother's story is like that of hundreds and thousands of men, women, and children who were swallowed up by the indenture system. In 1878, having drifted from her village to Varanasi, she was approached by a recruiter who would have offered her the chance to leave India and try her luck working as an agricultural labourer in a different country on a 5-year contract of work called an indenture. Surviving testimonies from the first generation of Indian indentured migrants cursed the recruiters employed by the British to travel to villages and cities and seek out potential workers. They were infamous for lying about the conditions of work, the length of the voyage, and the distance from India to the Caribbean. But my great-grandmother did not make the journey from India to the Caribbean alone. Her daughter, child of 6, travelled with her on her own indenture certificate and was expected to work as a condition of her contract. After 10 years residence in the Caribbean, labourers qualified for a return passage to India. Few accepted this. Some believed they had lost their caste or place in society by leaving, and others were attracted by the possibility of owning a small plot of land in lieu of accepting a return voyage home. The majority of Indians chose to stay in the countries to which they were indentured, but this does not mean that the system was fair, right, kind, or just. It was not slavery, but it was a system of unfree labour that confined people to a plantation under agreements that they were in large part unable to read in order to extract the maximum amount of work from them. Colonial records show us that recruits were beaten, sexually assaulted, exploited, denied wages, and could be imprisoned if they were too sick to work. It is a testament to the resilience of our ancestors that we, the descendants of Indian indentured labourers in the Caribbean, survived the system and can still be found in Guyana and Trinidad, and in communities in Jamaica, St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Vincent. And here, of course, because alongside African Caribbeans, we form part of the Windrush generation. So why don't you know about us? There's something important about the date that indenture started in the Caribbean, 1838. That's the fact that it coincides with the abolition of enslaved labour in 1834. The fact that a system of exploitative labour that involved the transportation of human beings across continents followed slavery troubles the British narrative of a benevolent empire brought to its senses in the 19th century. Because we were effectively erased from the telling of 19th century British imperial history, it has been easy for people to unsee us as part of the Windrush generation. This is my family story. I call it The Other Windrush. It's become part of an anthology published by Pluto Press, and here to share their own stories of the Other Windrush with you today are my co-contributors, actor Gordon Warnecke, poet Mr. G, and academic Dr. Nalini Mohabir. So I'd like to begin by asking Gordon to read for us from his chapter his contribution to the Other Windrush, Pepper Pot. Thanks, Gordon.
Thank you. When I was growing up in the 70s in England, my mother generally cooked English food. This was because when she lived in Guyana, her older sisters did all the cooking. I can still hear the men's heavy West Indian accents in the kitchen as they helped to cook a Guyanese curry. The food was washed down with Watney's pale ale from a small keg and Dubonnet, and of course a lot of rum. Clive, our Guyanese neighbour, would also often cook fried garlic pork. At least 8 large bulbs of the garlic would have been marinating in a jar of white wine vinegar for weeks. There was always dancing and music. Vinyl records played on the hi-fi system with Dolby noise reduction for cassettes, and invariably Calypso records along with hits of the 70s spun on the turntable. Despite the mix of nationalities, my mother always considered herself an English woman and had a slight disdain for the Asian families who moved into the area later on in the 1980s. I always suspected this was rooted in the way she was brought up in colonial Guyana. Her Christian upbringing and the fact that she didn't come from a farming background made her feel above the other Indians in Letterkenny. Sometimes Guyanese relations would come and visit us. My father would be exasperated when these relatives would turn up 2 or 3 hours late, usually without apologising. But he had to remember the latecomers went by GMT, Guyanese Mean Time. He never got used to their timekeeping, especially as he was German, and of course he was always punctual. Some of the relatives who visited were from the Lacu family. My grandmother's other sister had married Edward Lacu, who was the last Governor General of Guyana, and also became the acting president when Guyana became a republic on the 23rd of February 1970. Every time the visiting Guyanese relatives and friends had left our house, I noticed my mother adopted a thicker Guyanese accent. Once I remember she said to me, "Pass the rice, boy." I commented that I was Gordon, or son, and not boy, and that she had spent too long listening to how our relatives spoke. She calmly replied, "What are you talking about? Now pass me the rice, boy." My mistake. Rice boy was a name on the box of a plug-in rice steamer that sat on top of a cupboard in the kitchen. My mother was content to be in England, and having come from Guyana, where she and her family had very little compared to what she had now, our trip to Guyana in 1974 reinforced this. My parents took my brother, Colin, and I to Guyana for a family holiday when I was 11 and he was 7. My memories of this holiday are still incredibly vivid. I can recall the good times we had there, the relatives we visited and the food we ate. I remember seeing the sugarcane, which was growing in shiny rows, and passing sugar refineries in the car. We picnicked on 63 Beach, a beautiful deserted sandy beach in Berbice. The sea lapped at our feet while we were shown how to splice a coconut with a cutlass. We stayed mainly in New Amsterdam with my mum's closest sister, Eileen, who was now a missionary for the church, lived. We also stayed at the family house for a few days. My mother's brothers and sisters showed us some wonderful hospitality, and which we encountered everywhere in Guyana. Much to my father's annoyance and disbelief, the women never sat with us, even though they had made a feast of food. It was a Guyanese way. I can remember sitting for hours in a rocking chair on the porch of the wooden stilted house, blissfully enjoying guineps and listening to the sound the stones made as they dropped into a wooden basket at my feet. Many years later, my cousin Marina Budhouse, who's a writer, recorded a conversation with my mother. Marina has done a lot of research into our family's history and written a number of books. My mother told Marina that she hated going back to Guyana. She had already been back twice before our family holiday, and although she loved her family very much, her new roots in England had taken hold. My son Daniel and I met my second cousins in America 3 years ago. They seemed to be keeping the Guyanese way of life, and thankfully, because of our interest in Guyanese food, they shared their recipes with me. When we FaceTime each other, their Guyanese accents are still strong, despite having lived in America for many years. And the older I get, the more I seem to be drawn to Guyana. And this has been augmented by my son's desire to find out more about his roots. My mother wanted to become more English when she lived here, yet I question my own identity on a daily basis. Yes, I'm a North Londoner boy who has always felt English, but I'm being challenged internally on a daily basis by what is going on around me politically and by my own late recognition of my heritage. The Windrush scandal and the Black Lives Matter movement has raised, amongst other important issues, a re-examination of our past and encouraged British people to look at their own history and consider how colonialism has played a big part in how this country has been shaped. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon, for that beautiful reading. I'm going to hand over to our poet, Mr. G. I've chosen a slide for you there, G, and I think when people will hear you reading, they'll know why.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Mr. G, and this is a preface to a poem that appears in the book, The Other Windrush. In 2018, the editors of this anthology and their colleagues at Senate House Library commissioned me to write a poem to reflect on the centenary of the birth of the Indian Guyanese politician Cheddi Jagan. It was going to be part of an annual conference on the study of indentureship. In researching my poem, I was given access to the library's archive on Guyana. My final piece, A Tale of Three Rivers, was originally intended to be a reflection on the life of the Guyanese politician Cheddi Jagan. Jagan was a child of Indenture, a son of India, who stood up to the British and the Americans in his fight for his country's freedom. Growing up in an Indian Guyanese household, I was well aware of his name, his cause, and his tribe. But how can anyone speak about the politics of Cheddi Jagan without mentioning Forbes Burnham, a child of slavery, a son of Africa, a different name, a different cause, a different tribe? They were two close friends who eventually became enemies. It's a story that speaks to a divide that I've known all of my life, Indian against African. So the poem about Cheddi became my own tale of indenture, a story that is British, Indian, and African. The stories are all connected inside me, in the same way that the rivers are all connected inside the oceans. I now fully understand the sentiment behind the song by Brother Marvin, who I originally scoffed at, that it is a great privilege to be such a unique heritage, 50% African, 50% Indian. And here's the poem, A Tale of Three Rivers. They call it the land of many waters, but here's a tale of three rivers, and how they intertwine to reflect my life's many mirrors. The river Ganges baptized my indentured heart, while my ebony soul floated down the Nile. But the river Thames partitioned them apart before they could put the West on trial. What an agate enemy, but I'm yet to see Jahaji Bai. So I now speak the language found in the color of my teardrops. You see, I'm half Black African, and I'm half Guyanese Indian. My system's filled with two waters and a violence that saturates both traditions. I grew up in London, and between the 70s and 80s, I was toasted by Guyanese whispers poured onto family tables, by my uncles who harbored inebriated blisters from Windrush trips to echoed graveyards, candlelit shots of El Dorado, golden cities lost in split suggestions. By the first rule of the plantation is a choke your independence. Then they rob you at election, beat you at a rather no correction. But you don't want to ever be around when the cutlass slips. You don't want to ever hear the truth from the bandit's lips. Just pass me another drink by and don't watch my sips. And as for this Winston Churchill cigar, it's superb. Thus mumbled my drunk Indian uncle one Notting Hill night, over plates of Chinese food and spilt Madeira wine. I laughed as he struggled to form a sentence from pre-Columbian times because nobody at that table could speak their mother's tongue. He saw my childish giggles drenched in English privilege. For what did this little black boy from London know about the range or the village, about the rape or the pillage, or the blood that sugarcane delivers. Son Chapman, Wismar, these are names I can't envisage. So with an emotional quickness, he sobered up. Oh, she just laugh when we talk about Guyanese freedom. You just think England give independence easy? One flag down, another flag raised? But you know about the punishment, the price we pay. Africa and India went to war. And like a jaguar's roar, my peaceful waterfall was struck by this stumbling stone. It rippled inside my bloodstream with self-destructive overload. Indian arteries attacking my black veins. African bones puncturing my brown lungs, as the river Nile and the river Ganges fought to escape the lowest rung. Meanwhile, by the river Thames, we fed breadcrumbs to the swans. And it was on this day in 1980, I heard another Windrush story. My uncle told me of a British-owned Guyana, 1953, where the Booker Prize for fiction has to be seen to be believed. He told me of two young men, one called Forbes, one called Chedi, who united to win their country's first democratic election. A child of India and a child of Africa sounding the thunder for independence. But Washington and Westminster can make paving stones of good intentions. For history has a power, and its power can form a weapon, and Lord knows every weapon can be turned upon itself. My uncle told me that Africans died moving 100 million tons of dirt to mold Guyana's destiny from the sea. And then Indian backs were brought in and put to work because plantation charm is sugar sweet. And Amerindian land rights were dispersed by whites, Chinese, and Portuguese. So for someone to reverse from all this hurt, they got to speak to Alawi. Because there's no point in shouting at the lock unless your voice provides the key. And Chedi and Forbes found that freedom's door handle was blocked by those who claimed democracy. But there were some things that they couldn't foresee. Did they really think the River Thames wants the River Nile and the River Ganges to agree and include the River Amazon and rejoin the Sea of Liberty? Did they not think that the CIA and MI6 will split these rivers into streams? And if you can count the number of boats offering you a better life in London, you better count the number of the beast. Now watch your streams proportion to trickle. Mommy, I can get the core water to the store. There's nothing left to eat. Now come see your trickles reduced to droplets, leaving you hungry in the streets, where the hatred of your neighbor is the only religion that you believe. Finally, let your droplets dictate your tears as election fever disappears. I've seen Guyanese of all races drown their sorrows in London's pubs, 2 shots of rum for every beer. They call it the land of many waters, but I could only speak of 3 rivers and how they intertwine to reflect my life's many mirrors. Perhaps the legacy of Guyanese independence is one that's yet to be defined. I just pray that one day the River Berbice, the River Essequibo, and the River Demerara will flow into our hearts and free our minds.
Thank you so much, G, for sharing your poem with us. It's so personal, it's very private, and it feels really special to listen to it. So thank you so much. I'd now like to hand you over to our final reader. It's my dear colleague, Dr. Nalini Mohabir, who I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with for some 15 years now. Thank you, Nalini, for reading from your chapter for the Other Windrush, Made Through Movement.
Thanks so much, Maria, and thanks to my other presenters. What an incredible panel, and I'm really honored to be able to share my experiences or my parents' experiences with everyone. They're different, than the other stories or poetry that we've heard, and that's the beauty of this point in time that we're at and thinking about Indenture, is that we actually have time to tell not just the single stories, but the different and individual stories. The one that I'm going to share is my introduction to an interview that I did with my parents, who migrated from the Caribbean to the UK and then to Canada when their visas expired. And this is from a chapter called Made Through Movement. Sailing from Port of Spain to Southampton, she stands alone at the docks, suitcase in hand. In Trinidad, she's a salesperson. In Britain, she'll train to be a nurse. A subsequent migration to Canada, however, means that the career proves elusive. qualifications not recognized as a result of crossing an ocean, she will become a retail worker once again. Hundreds of Caribbean women made momentous journeys during the middle decades of the 20th century from places deemed smallish. But what do maps know? You've seen these women in their worn coats and black orthopedic shoes, plastic bags at their feet, standing on a subway platform in London, New York, or Toronto. They're on their way home after another long shift in the service industry, maybe retail, food, home care. My mother's hands are an ocean, but only a generation away from hard work in the fields, unlike me, whose only fieldwork has been that of academic tourism. I first interviewed my mother for a stage production at Leeds about a decade ago. Produced by the Jamaican scholar Carol Marie Webster, the piece was entitled Mother Libation, in commemoration of mothering in the African diaspora. My inclusion in this kind of production is perhaps only possible in the UK, a site where ex-colonials encountered each other and creolization takes on the form of political blackness. I was also asked to participate as someone of Indian Caribbean descent, because we have been positioned in relation to African Caribbean experiences since our arrival in the region. We come to know ourselves through the complexity of stories emanating from the womb of the Caribbean and its diaspora. My mother's story was not easy to come by, but emerged slowly on a need-to-know basis. As in, child, why you ask me that? I was first motivated because I wanted to know more about her relationship with Auntie Myrtle from Barbados. This was a friendship sustained across borders for 50 years. Each year, without fail, Auntie Myrtle in the UK would post Christmas presents to Canada, socks and scarves from Marks and Spencer for me, tea and biscuits for my parents. When I moved from Toronto to Leeds to pursue graduate studies, my mother informed me that Auntie Myrtle would be my, quote, mom away from home, unquote. And she was. My mom, Amarin, grew up in the south of Trinidad, Siparia, where she went to a school run by Canadian Presbyterian missionaries. Since she was Muslim, she also attended the masjid and received Arabic lessons. But her parents made sure she went to other religious services too. The daily lived experience of creolization, of intermixture and enrichment in Trinidad meant that she also attended the Pentecostal church, spiritual Baptist ceremonies, and the Hindu mandir. Trinidad might be a small island, but it contained a world, to paraphrase Samuel Selvin. In 1965, at the age of 25, her world widened. She stood at the docks of Port of Spain with carloads of family, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, nieces, and nephews who came from all corners of the island to say farewell, perhaps sensing her departure would be without a return. My older cousin told me that as a young girl, her dreams expanded thanks to seeing my mother board the ship, the Pinta, alone. Mom was the first to leave Trinidad. Like many women from the Caribbean, marriage and work wasn't an either-or choice, and her aspirations weren't confined to wife or mother. She was leaving to seek an education and career in England. She broadened all our horizons. When my mother arrived in England, the hospital was supposed to send someone to pick her up, but they forgot. So she hitched a ride with an ambulance. The matron was oh so apologetic and offered my mom, who had been traveling all day on an empty stomach, pork and beans. Luckily, before any unease set in, she met Auntie Myrtle. Myrtle was my mother's nursing college roommate. They shared a sparse room with 2 beds and a dorm. Myrtle had arrived 3 years earlier from Barbados and had an older sister in London who provided a nurturing lifeline of pepper sauce, plantain, rice and peas delivered on the weekends to Auntie Myrtle and my mother. I have a feeling this made up for the pork. Myrtle taught my mother and her fellow nurses from the Caribbean how to shop, travel, negotiate freedoms and restrictions in this new space. But how did they not only survive, but thrive? Well, they found time to be young, to date, to dress up, to sip tea like Caribbean queens at Harrods, and I imagine to dance, not necessarily to the Mighty Sparrow, but perhaps a little wine to Tom Jones or the Beatles or whatever else moved the dance clubs in Reading. But most of all, they survived through the lessons learned in the Caribbean about solidarity, kinship, and living with difference. Thank you.
Nalini, thank you so much for that reading, and thanks to Mr. G and to Gordon. It has been a pleasure to be part of South Asian Heritage Month. Normally our stories are marginalized in South Asian history and in histories of the Caribbean. So it's nice to have this forum where we can come together and talk about the things that have made us a community, an indentured labour diaspora. So thank you for joining us all today. And we hope that you can find time to connect with our stories by reading The Other Windrush. Many thanks and goodbye to everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.